Welcome. Today we are looking at Form 3 work, Chapter 3, the writing of the prophetic messages. This chapter includes definition of terms prophets and prophecy, categories of prophets, the importance of prophets, characteristics of prophets, the writing of prophetic messages, the relationship between the Old Testament and the New Testament prophets, comparison between traditional African and Old Testament prophets. So here we're going to look at the questions and answers from past kcse papers. Question 1A. Discuss how Jesus fulfilled the Old Testament prophecies about the Messiah. Nathan's prophecy to David that God will make his descendants to rule over Israel forever is affirmed by angel Gabriel during the Annunciation. That is in Luke chapter 1 verse 32. The conception of Mary fulfills the prophecy of Isaiah. That is Isaiah chapter 7 verse 14. Jesus was born in the town of Bethlehem of Judah, as had been prophesied by prophet Micah. When Jesus taught in the synagogue in Nazareth at the beginning of his ministry, he quoted from Isaiah, that is Isaiah chapter 61 from verse 1 to 2, to affirm that he was the Messiah that Isaiah talks about, or to affirm that, or rather he affirmed also when John sent his disciples to Jesus to acquire whether he was the Messiah. The messianic age foretold in the Old Testament is enacted by Jesus when he turns water into wine at Cana in Galilee. Remember, here you can also give examples of other miracles that Jesus did. No miracles, Jesus shared the suffering of mankind, thus fulfilling the prophecy of suffering servant that is in Isaiah chapter 33 verse 4. The Old Testament prophecy of the peaceful king is fulfilled by Jesus during the triumphant entry when he enters Jerusalem riding on a donkey. That is Isaiah chapter 62 verse 11. The rejection and death of Jesus were foretold in the Old Testament. That is in Psalms chapter 118 from verse 22 to 23. The new covenant foretold by Jeremiah is fulfilled by Jesus during the Last Supper. Or rather, you can just say the new covenant foretold by Jeremiah is fulfilled by Jesus' death, resurrection, and forgiveness of sins. Question 1b. Why did the prophets of the Old Testament condemn the way the Israelites worshipped? People became concerned with external practices, or you can just say people became concerned with external observances, yet their hearts were far from God. This is also called hypocrisy. Religion became too commercialized that money could be used to buy favors from God. People broke the 10 Commandments, that is, they disobeyed God's commands. People forgot the saving mighty works of God. Or rather, you can just say they worshipped foreign gods. For example, they worshipped Baal, Asherah, and other idols. The poor were hated, or rather, you can just say the poor were despised. Rather, they were considered outcasts. The widows were neglected. Also, here includes the orphans were also neglected. People believed in false prophets and also they believed in their false prophecies. People practiced syncretism. Question 1c. With reference to the Old Testament, outline the characteristics of a true prophet. A true prophet must have been called by God. A true prophet communicated God's message to the people. A true prophet spoke with authority. A true prophet understood the nature of their prophecies. A true prophet acknowledged only one God. A true prophet received revelations in the form of dreams, visions, and symbolic actions. Their prophecies came to pass. They understood the nature of their prophecies. They proclaimed punishment and rewards to individual and to the whole nation. Question 2a. Explain the role of prophets in the Old Testament. They spoke on behalf of God, or rather, you can just say they were God's messengers or God's mouthpieces. They foretold the future events. They guided the kings, or rather, they counseled the kings. They called people back to repentance, or rather, they gave people messages of hope. They reminded the people about the covenant. They condemned the evil in the society. They God. A true prophet received revelations in the form of dreams, visions, and symbolic actions. Their prophecies came to pass. They understood the nature of their prophecies. They proclaimed punishment and rewards to individual and to the whole nation. Question 2a. Explain the role of prophets in the Old Testament. They spoke on behalf of God, or rather, you can just say they were God's messengers or God's mouthpieces. They foretold the future events. They guided the kings, or rather, they counseled the kings. They called people back to repentance, or rather, they gave people messages of hope. They reminded the people about the covenant. They condemned the evil in the society. They warned the people of God's judgment. They made the people understand the nature of God. They offered sacrifices to God. They anointed kings. They interpreted the vision or dreams from God. Rather, they interpreted current events. Question 2b. Describe the characteristics of false prophets in the Old Testament. They asked for payment for their services, or that is, their services were for material gains. They were self-appointed, that is, they had no call from God. Their prophecies were not fulfilled. They spoke what the people wanted to hear, that is, they wanted to please the people. They raised false confidence among the people. They did not speak with authority when challenged. They spoke about doctrines, or rather, they spoke about teachings that were contrary to the covenant. The first point was there is that they spoke about doctrines which are contrary to the covenant way of life. Their lives were not exemplary, that is, they were hypocrites. They wanted favors from the kings. They were not ready to suffer for the truth. They undermined the work of the prophets. That is, they undermined the work of the true prophets. Question 2c. State three differences between the prophets in the Old Testament and traditional African communities. The Old Testament prophets stresses the worship of one God. That is, the Old Testament prophets stress on monotheism. While in some other traditional African communities, prophets recognized many gods and goddesses. So remember, that is while in some African communities, not all. The Old Testament prophets received their power guidance directly from God. That is, they received their power and guidance directly from God, while the African traditional prophets got their power from God through the living dead and the spirits. The Old Testament prophets faced opposition from their people, while in traditional African prophets were confined to their ethnic communities. So therefore, they did not receive or face any opposition. The work of Old Testament prophets were recorded and reserved, while the African traditional community prophets, their work was handed over through oral traditions. Question 3a. Explain ways in which prophets of God were important in the life of the nation of Israel. They acted as mediators between God and the people. God spoke to the prophets to communicate information about the future. They preached practical monotheism and condemned idolatry. That is, they preached only worshipping one God, and they condemned idolatry. They condemned all forms of social evils and ritual sins. They acted as the conscience of the kings. They foretold the punishment that would come to people for not obeying God. They gave people hope of being restored to God if they repented their sins. Question 3b. What lessons can Christians learn from the lives of Old Testament prophets? Christians should use the gift of prophecy for the glory of God. Christians, like Old Testament prophets, should always stand for truth. Christians should always condemn the social, political, and economic evils such as corruption in the society. Christians, like the Old Testament prophets, should lead holy lives. They should expect persecution in their work as God's messengers. Old Testament prophets like Jeremiah were rejected and persecuted by their own people. That is now, them as Christians should expect persecution in their work as God's messengers. For example, in the Old Testament prophets like Jeremiah, who were rejected and persecuted by their own people. Christians, like the Old Testament prophets, should be ready to obey God's call. Christians should realize that God is universal and they should reach out to all people. Question 3c. Identify the various ways through which the Old Testament prophets communicated their messages to the people. That is, they communicated their messages through lyrics, sermons, letters, for example, Jeremiah's letters, songs or poems, lamentations, symbolizations, lifestyles, for example, the lifestyle of Hosea, miracles, for example, Moses and Elijah, and prose narratives. Question 4a. State the relevance of prophets to Christians today. Christians should always stand for the truth. Christians should be ready to be messengers of God. Christians should use the gift of prophecy for the glory of God and the common good of the people. Like the prophets, Christians should pass the message of God without fear or favor. Christians should condemn all evils in the society, such as corruption, oppression of the poor, and injustice. Christians should be role models and live an exemplary holy life. The Christians should pray to God for guidance, wisdom, and inspiration. Christians should not be confined to the people of their community, but should reach out for the non-Christians, for God is universal. Christians should expect opposition and suffering in their work of preaching the gospel. Question 4b. Briefly explain the various categories of true prophets in Israel. Major prophets. These include Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and Daniel. Their messages are written in the specific books that bear their names. They are called major prophets because the books are long and contain clearly written messages. When we have minor prophets, these refer to the 12 books in the Bible that are short and contain less information than those in major books. The books are Amos, Hosea, Joel, Obadiah, Micah, Nahum, Habakkuk, Zephaniah, Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi. Canonical prophets. Both the major and minor prophets are together referred to as canonical prophets. This means that the utterances of each prophet are recorded in the individual books that bear their names. This is a contrast from the way the activities and early utterances of earlier prophets are preserved. For example, the work and the prophecies of prophets Moses, Elijah, Elisha, Nathan, and God are preserved alongside many other accounts of events and rulers. There are no specific books bearing their names. The early prophets. These belonged to guilds or schools. They lived together in communities and a chief prophet who was their leader. Elijah and Elisha were leaders of such prophetic commissions. They traveled around together, delivering oracles as occasion demanded. That is, the early prophets traveled together, around together, delivering oracles as the occasion demanded. Cultic prophets. There were some prophets who served in places of worship, for example, at Bethel in Jerusalem. These were called cultic prophets because they were associated with religious activities in shrines. They worked side by side with priests and played a special role in worship. These prophets were also regarded as experts in prayer, especially intercessory prayers. They were called to bring people's petitions before Yahweh. They also communicated their divine answer to a particular petition and indicated whether an offering was acceptable or not. Question 4c. Discuss the similarities of traditional African and Old Testament prophets. Both traditional African and Old Testament prophets were called by God to pass messages to the people and were in direct communication with Him. Both warned the people of impending dangers and disasters due to people's misconduct and disobedience. Both had supernatural experiences, but they communicated with God through dreams, visions, and traces. They were both expected to be people of integrity, high moral standing, and obedient to God's call. In both, being a prophet meant giving the people messages from God, such as judgments and warning them to turn away from evil. In some cases, prophets in both traditional African society and Old Testament performed the role of healers. For example, Prophet Isaiah interceded in curing the illness of King Hezekiah in 2 Kings chapter 20, while in some traditional African communities, prophets performed the roles of diviners, medicine persons, and mediums. That is, they treated people for physical and mental illnesses. In traditional African society and Old Testament, both stood up against oppression and championed the liberty of their people. In both traditional African society and the Old Testament, prophets were expected to obey God's call. In both, prophets were charismatic personalities, and lastly, both were consulted to reveal God's will to the people. Did you understand? Kindly add more points in the comment section. Let me know what to look at in tomorrow's video. Thanks a lot for subscribing and listening to me. God bless you.